So far, we've written this simulation function, and then we've collected data from it in a pandas data frame. And now I want to show you how we can visualize some of the data in that data frame using this library called Altair, which, as I said, it's not as mainstream as the other things I'm going over in these videos, and it's pretty new to me, but I've been really impressed with what I've seen of it so far. So just because I might want to change it again, let me get access to this data frame we made in the previous video. And let me put it down here in the plotting data section. So there we have 100 by 3 data frame, 100 rows, 3 columns. And the syntax for Altair definitely takes a little getting used to. So for probably the first week that I used it, I was just copying and pasting and trying to understand piece by piece. It eventually starts to make some sense, but still feels a little overly complicated sometimes. So ALT is the way we imported the library. It was the abbreviation we gave to it. And then chart, that's like the main thing made by Altair. And now we tell it the name of a pandas data frame. So we'll use this name df up here. And now we say how we want to mark the points. So let me say mark circle. And there are options you can put in here, but the default is usually fine. And then here is the heart of the definition. So you say, where should the x-axis come from? And for us, let's say the x-axis comes from this true probability column. So because we told it it's getting the data from this df data frame, then when it sees this, it knows to look for a column in that data frame with that name. And now the same thing for the y-axis, and that'll be return on investment. So this has 100 points in it, one for each of the rows of our data frame. And the x-axis value corresponds to true probability, so always between 0 and 1. And then the return on investment part, it's always between -1, because you can't lose more than your entire bet. And highest is this 8.4, probably different from in the previous video because I reevaluated everything. So if I go up here, the maximum, 9.044, but I guess that's different because here I also reevaluated it. So if I do df.describe.transpose, then return on investment, what's the maximum? 8.4, exactly. So not the same as what's up here. Okay, good. I mean, it's kind of a coincidence that it is also the very first row in the data frame. If you ever want to sort the data frame, you can do something like df.sort values, return on investment. And by default, it sorts from smallest to biggest, but then you can also reverse it by saying ascending equals false. So I don't want those values to be ascending. I want them to be descending. There's just another useful operation on a pandas data frame, but that's not the topic of this video. The topic is how can we get information from this chart? And so let's make the data frame a little bigger. And Altair will yell at me if I try making it more than 5,000 rows. So let's make 5,000. And let's not try to display it on the screen. And so there are 5,000 different data points. And they're much more clustered at the bottom here. And why is that? Well, remember that if you're betting at minus odds, then if we start at -110, then you're never going to have a return on investment bigger than 90%. So I'd say roughly 50-50 of our rows are going to correspond to minus odds and plus odds. But the plus odds have all this different space to spread out, whereas the minus odds, they're always going to be between -1 and 1 for the return on investment, because you can never earn more than your initial investment if you're betting at minus odds. So one way to get around this, let's see, let me bring this down into the same cell so I don't have to keep scrolling up and down. So one way to get around that, like, let's go down to 1,000 points. I think that looks a little better. And what I said was that the minus odds are all clustered in this small band here. So let's just use fewer of the minus odds. So instead of having a step size of -10, let's have a step size of -50. So now you can see it looks much more spread out. And so this is fine, and this by itself we could probably do pretty much equally easily in Matplotlib or in Seaborn, which are two other plotting libraries in Python. But here are some nice things that we can do in Altair. And I think some of the coolest things you can do in Altair involve interactivity, but I'm not going to do any of that in this video. So let's give this some color. So let's say color equals an ROI. So it's not very interesting. All this is doing is it's putting lighter colors for smaller values of ROI and darker shades of blue for the bigger values of ROI. But what's really interesting is we can also use any other column from our data frame. So we can use the odds column, for example. And so these minus odds, they're sort of clustered at the bottom, whereas the higher plus odds, they show up at the top. Okay, but we can make that even more clear. Like, let's get rid of that line. And instead of having all of these different values, we could say, let's just take -400, -200, 200, 400. So now there are only 4 different types of odds. And I can make it a little easier to read by telling, this is what's called an encoding type, by telling Altair that these should be thought of as discrete values rather than like a continuous spectrum. And so one way to do that would be to say :O. Okay, now it just tells me, like, rather than the whole spectrum in this legend, it tells me what are the 4 specific values. Okay, if I go back to my old way, this will still work, but it will be much less clear because now it has all these different odds to work with. So let's go back to the smaller one. And I think it's kind of easier to read if I say they're not ordered. I mean, they are ordered, but for this small number, it'll make it easier to read. So you can see that the 2 minus numbers, they're clustered much closer together in terms of the return on investment than these plus numbers. So another way to think about it is adding, I think these are called cents, adding 200 cents from 200 to 400. That makes a lot more of a difference versus adding 200 cents from -400 to -200 in terms of the return on investment. And you can kind of see that visually here. Let's go back to the full picture. Here it just looks like chaos, so that isn't very interesting. And there's back to the default way. And I'll post a link to this color scheme section. And one thing I really like here is it shows different colors we can use. So let me copy this. And let's see, the species doesn't make any sense here. This is what's supposed to be the odds, saying, like, what is the value that the colors should come from? What column in our data frame should this correspond to? And now for the scheme, you can click here to go see some different options for schemes. And I kind of like this oranges or this purples one. Let's do purples. And let's make a second data frame that only contains minus 110 odds. So let me save this or copy it and put it here. And I think 100 points is probably going to be fine. And how about I'll say probs. This can be rng.random, and we'll have points of these. And the secret reason why I want to do this in a little different way from the previous way is because I want to make the numbers like much bigger eventually in the last video. And to do that, it's a little easier to not do the charting part or the plotting part until the very end and not make a data frame at all. So here are the probs, and for the, let's say, ROIs for return on investments. And this, it'll be sim x minus 110 reps for x in probs. And so what does this do? This is what's called list comprehension. And it says, have x go through each element in this NumPy array that I just made. And for each of those elements, put this into this ROI list that I'm making. So let's just look at it. So let me put this down in its own cell. And so there's probs, and there's the ROIs. And if you don't understand this and you want to look it up, look up list comprehension. And now in here, let's make a new data frame. Let's call it df2 for the second data frame. Pandas data frame. And now I'll make this using a dictionary. And again, I'll say there's a true prob column, and that'll be from this probs NumPy array. This odds column, okay, that'll just always be minus 110. And the ROI column, that'll be from this ROIs list. And let's see, did I make it right? And let's see, does it make sense that if the true probability is 77 and we're betting at minus 110 odds, then we get about a 43% profit per bet? Yes, that sounds about right. Okay, so I think I did that okay. Let's delete that. Don't need any of this stuff. And this will be the same, but now I want to use the df2 column. And to make it stand out more, instead of using purples, let's just use a single color. Because remember, this is supposed to correspond to the odds, and we only have one odds. Okay, and here's the syntax. I know the syntax takes some getting used to. Oh, and I put values when I should have said value. And I can combine these different charts. So let me call this, how about A1? Okay, so I just named that chart. I can call this A2. And now I can combine both of those by doing A1 plus A2. And it matters what order you do these in. For example, if I do A2 plus A1, then pay attention to the lower left part. A lot of these red dots are going to disappear. And why did they disappear? Because the thing that's written later gets plotted later. So I'm plotting all of these purple points later, and so they're covering up the red points. But having the red points at the front, I think, is what makes the most sense. And let's see, maybe the last thing I'll do is to show you one more neat part of Altair. So in addition to saying X values, Y values, and color, I can also have something called tooltip. And let's just say this is all of the columns. And let's see, what mistake have I made? Maybe I have to convert it into a list. Yeah, okay, that seems good. And now let's do the same thing in the second one. And really this is fine, but I think it looks more elegant to have df2, but they have the same columns, so that doesn't matter. And now it doesn't seem like anything changed, but now if I put my mouse over one of these, then it tells me like what were the values from all of the different columns for that specific point. Okay, so these higher ones, these ones with the bigger return on investment, they're going to correspond to higher ROI, like this one had ROI 9, and they'll correspond to higher odds. And I guess the last thing to notice is just pay attention to how these all seem to lie on a line. And in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find what is the line corresponding to this minus 110 odds number. And then once I have that line, I can ask, where does that line cross what maybe I think of as the x-axis, or maybe what I should think of as the true probability axis? And where it crosses that axis, that's where it corresponds to the 0 return on investment. And so that value, where it crosses, is going to be the true probability for the break-even percentage. Yeah, so that's all I'll do in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with the last video where we use scikit-learn to find the equation of that line.